It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Joe Biden is hardly the first sitting president to face pressure to not seek re-election. Whether it's concerns about declining popularity or health issues, several past presidents have had to confront the same questions and skepticism Biden does today. They include Franklin Roosevelt, whose inner circle was deeply divided about him seeking a fourth term, or Woodrow Wilson, who'd suffered a series of small strokes, or Lyndon Johnson, whose approval ratings had plunged due to his handling of the Vietnam War and who also had health problems. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, I spoke with presidential historian Will Randall, who's written 13 books, including several about U.S. presidents, and whose credentials include teaching history for 26 years at Champlain College. We'll kick off our discussion after a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. As we sit here now, Joe Biden is still in the race. There's a number of people that are looking for him to get out. I read a piece this morning, James Carville, the Democratic strategist, editorial board of the New York Times. Joe Biden seems to be insistent right now he's going to stay in. And the reason I wanted to talk with you, Professor Randall, is, I would imagine that this is not the first time in American history that we've had a president in this similar situation.
In fact, we go almost all the way back. John Quincy Adams was the most unpopular president of the 19th century. He was considered effete, too intellectual, even though he was the one that was a diplomat that got the peace treaty after the War of 1812. But he lost to an immensely popular soldier named Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson mobilized people who were not educated at Harvard or Yale, who had axes to grind and tomahawks to bend over the heads of all the Indians because they wanted to exterminate the Indians, not send them to Mexico, but to get rid of them. So he was the spokesman. Jackson was the spokesman for the disgruntled. And Quincy Adams won the first time because he chose the man who helped him get the peace treaty from the War of 1812, Henry Clay, but because Clay threw in his candidacy and joined Adams, that was called a corrupt bargain. So he had charges of corruption right away. After he was elected, narrowly, Adams would be booed at the theater when he went with his wife. He was so unpopular. He should not have run again, except he was obsessed with the presidency. He wanted to stay president. And he was doing a lot of good. I mean, he was still the diplomat in the Monroe Doctrine to protect America. That was his doing. But the people wanted change, big change. And they got it with Andrew Jackson. And Quincy Adams would not bow out. He would not step down. So that's the first example I can think of. And it goes on from there. The likelihood of finishing your term in the presidency is less than you might think. We've had not only assassinations, but we've had quite a number of presidents die in office. Everything from eating too much ice cream on a hot day, Taylor, to accidents. So about 1 in 6 presidents do not finish their terms. So there's always that risk that somebody's not going to make it all the way through. Luckily, we haven't had an assassination in a very long time.
Well, it's an incredibly stressful job.
It is a stressful job, and age has been a question from the very beginning. For example, well, let's bring it up to date. Woodrow Wilson, not that long ago, he had a series of minor strokes. He concealed them from the public. His wife was very bright, and she kept things going while he finished his second term. But he wanted to run again. And finally, the party talked him into not doing it. So you got one of the most corrupt presidents we've ever had, Harding, after him. And Woodrow Wilson was probably right. He could have stayed on because much more work was done by the cabinet in those days. There wasn't such an idea of hands-on chief executive. And you can bring it up to looking at FDR.
Yeah.
FDR insisted on a third term. And he'd won by a runaway after his second term, and war had broken out in Europe, and he thought it was terribly important that he stay in.
Continuity.
But when it came time to decide on a fourth term, he couldn't be talked out of it. And he was terribly unpopular with the party. So much so that he had to change his vice presidential candidate, and he was so unpopular he did not go to the convention in Chicago. He sent Eleanor Roosevelt. And he only lasted a few weeks, basically, after his inauguration. But he was obviously so sick. There were photographs by then of him under a heavy cape on a warm day, posing with Churchill and Stalin, because he insisted on flying from Washington to Yalta in East Germany. In those days, it was not on Air Force One. It was a flying boxcar. So he came back from that exhausted and insisted on going ahead anyway. So we have, we can bring things up to Ronald Reagan.
I remember that one quite clearly in '84.
Yeah. And his age was an issue. He was 73 when he ran for his second term.
Yep.
And nobody thought anybody could be a president for 4 more years. He did. And then he lasted several years after that.
Well, I remember distinctly watching that debate with him and Mondale, where Mondale tried to bring it up, and he had that famous line Reagan had about, I won't bring up, if you don't bring up my age, I won't bring up your inexperience.
Yes. Are you old enough and experienced enough to be president?
Yeah, it was one of the great lines in a debate.
Yeah, well, he was a great debater. And some similarities there. He had a lot of experience. He had his own radio show. He was in the newsreels all the time. He had a distinct edge over Fritz, who was solid Midwest and all of that, but very flat-footed. And that was telling, I think, in the final analysis. So the debate has become, to me, a real test of the Constitution, that so much of the process can hinge on a half an hour's performance under very unusual circumstances. There's no audience there. So if you're used to being in a closed room with just the equipment, and you've done a lot of filming of television that way, you have a distinct edge. And then if you've just flown through 100 time zones, as Biden puts it, and you've been at Normandy and you've been with all sorts of world leaders, and then you don't listen to your staff and stop it, take a nap, well, he, as he put it himself, and I think it's true, he fell asleep on the stage. We'll never really know completely what did it, but it could have been just Robitussin. But the fact is, so much weight is being put on that. And that is not what the Founding Fathers intended, if you want to talk about intention. It was entirely left up to electors. And it took over a century before the ordinary citizen had any say, because you have constitutional amendment after amendment to amendment before you get men and women, black and white, or any color, able to vote. I think this whole thing of Founding Fathers intent gives me the willies, because I've spent 50 years studying the Founding Fathers. They never in a million years would have said, we expect things to be the same 250 years from now. So there are some big holes in the Constitution that I think need to be fixed, whether that'll ever happen. But I think the whole idea of making it a television show instead of an election, or insisting on the Electoral College, but then being willing to say, oh, you just lost a hand of poker, throw your chips in and get out of here. We need somebody else in your chair. That's not a very good way to choose a president either.
Well, and in his defense, but Biden is well known in his knowledge that he is not a good public speaker. He has a pretty profound stutter that he's overcome. When he talked about how he prepares for a State of the Union address, they really simplify the language so that he can pull that off. On the other hand, I think most Americans would say they were pretty concerned and a bit aghast at watching him, that it wasn't just a bad night, but perhaps an indication that he's not up for, he just doesn't have the capacity to do it. And that's just, we're all getting older.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very interesting point, because we're all getting older. This population is getting older.
And we're living longer.
We're living longer. We want that. And there's a price to pay. We expect people to be able to go on no matter what they're going through. There'll be some medication that'll help them, some therapy, some treatment. Well, if that's all true, you have to make allowances in the political process, I think. Benjamin Franklin was 83 when he went to the Constitutional Convention, and he's the one that got our Constitution. He couldn't make it on his own. If he'd had to walk into Independence Hall, he couldn't. He was carried in a sedan chair by prisoners, but he never missed a section. He had to put up his foot on a stool that he invented, of course, to keep the circulation going. But he was the one that inspired everybody else, and he's the one that came up with the compromises that kept the thing from failing. I find a little bit of analogy there. How old was Winston Churchill when he ran for an interrupted second term, and when he did much more good than he could so close to World War II? Mm-hmm. We don't have an enormous supply of Franklins and Churchills, but when we have somebody who's effective, and then we don't have a bullpen full of effective possibilities, then I have to wonder, what is the sensible thing for the public to do, what to expect? I don't have any answers, except that from the very beginning it's been about choices, who the candidates are. You've had Grant, enormously popular for a while, until an opponent came along and pointed out some small gifts that he got from investors, Credit Immobilier, contracts, etc. And along came the charges and no defense. So out went U.S. Grant. He wanted a third term. And never mind, he was enormously unpopular in the South because he'd sent the army in to clean up the act. Woodrow Wilson was too sick to go on, but he was the one who had gone to Versailles negotiated the peace treaty that could have prevented World War II because he believed you had to have an international organization to keep the peace. He came home and he couldn't sell it. He didn't want to give up at that point, even though he kept having these minor strokes. So he tried to be reelected, and he was beaten. FDR had the same idea, that to avoid having another catastrophic world war, you needed an international organization that made deep changes that everybody agreed to. So for him, he wanted to stay on and see the United Nations born, which he did. And when he died, his widow is the one that gave us our Human Rights Charter and added some humanity to the mix. So he wanted to hang on for that. I can understand that impulse, and I can even defend it. But when it comes down to it, it's the choice of who the candidates are. And it's going to be very interesting for me to see the choice that people make now. More than interesting, because to me, do we go on with this trend of changing the channel if we don't like the show? To be an historian and a journalist is interesting because a historian can come up with all these stories, but the journalist still wants to see how the story is going to come out and interpret it as it goes.
Go back to Franklin Roosevelt, you said there were people that were trying to talk him out of running for a fourth term. Like who?
His staff. What I read was by George Christian, who was his personal secretary, and gives a blow-by-blow in Texas Observer, I think it is, of the last days and the medical decisions. And the White House staff was split over whether he should go on or not. But it came down to they had data. They had medical data. The man had congestive heart failure. And that flight was enough to kill him, that ordeal. And he'd had episode after episode, but he'd kept it secret. One of the big differences now, it's hard to keep any secrets.
I was thinking that just as you were saying it, we're living in a different world now where, not only do we have social media and everything else, but people, I think, are less capable of keeping. I mean, would Woodrow Wilson have been able to have keep that information quiet today? I kind of doubt it.
No, it took a long time for a Yale professor to do his lifetime's research and figure it out. And what do you do about the truth? You can find out, sometimes you can find out the truth, but what if it's impossible? What if the social media and the news and whatever sources have created a mythology around a candidate that his adherents believe more than any facts would tell you? I've taught history for 35 years in Vermont, and the reason I've hung in there, it certainly hasn't been the pay, because I think we need an educated electorate, and I would do two things differently if I could. One, everybody to graduate from high school would have to take the citizenship test. It's marvelous. You just write to the superintendent of documents in Washington, and you get this booklet, and you see what every applicant for admission has to learn. How many students could pass that? Some states have had it. Massachusetts had it until a governor came and thought it was discriminatory and threw it out. But you couldn't go to the University of Massachusetts for many, many years until you passed that test coming out of high school. So that's one thing. It's the kind of thing we can change if we don't know our history. I mean, I'm not saying anything original. We are doomed to repeat it.
What would be in that test that would be helpful for us, that would be helpful today?
What do we mean by separation of powers? When the Supreme Court makes a ruling that shifts the balance of power from one branch of the government to another. That they would learn that there was a big question about, was that constitutional? Oh, and by the way, what are the limits on the Supreme Court? Well, I haven't taken that test, but I wonder if most people know that the Supreme Court was not in the Constitution. It was an act of Congress, the Judiciary Act of 1789, after the Constitution went into effect. And from then on, it was people like John Marshall, Chief Justice, taking power by fiat, by making decisions, this decision or that decision, that then became presidents. So what you could find out, what are the limits of each of these branches of government? What are they supposed to do? What's the president supposed to do? I think we need to know that. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of the social media and pundits.
There's been resistance by Biden, at least in the last couple of weeks, to release all of his medical records. Should we, as a public, demand that?
Well, we didn't demand it of Nixon. He had been seeing a psychiatrist for years. But when Eagleton tried to run as a Democrat, they went after Eagleton and blocked him. That's a question. I think it's a very big question.
Yeah, Eagleton was the VP nominee with McGovern and had to drop off the ticket because he'd had electric convulsive therapy.
Right.
I mean, he was just, there was no question. He just was gone.
And then you get to does the president lose his rights as a citizen? We all depend on HIPAA, which guarantees the right of privacy. Our doctors cannot circulate things. They're very. Does the president lose that? What are the limits on that? I think we need to establish that. It helps if it's voluntary, and especially when there's suspicions raised.
Well, and also when you have the ability to annihilate the world and you have the nuclear button at your fingertip.
Oh, absolutely.
Because I read recently, I was reading a book about Vietnam and some journalists that were covering it, and there were people that on Nixon's staff that wanted to keep him away. It was not only his mental health, but also his alcoholism, that they wanted to keep him away from the nuclear codes pretty much after dinner. So where do we draw that line? I mean, right now, Joe Biden is the oldest person elected president, and Trump is number 3. So we clearly people are living older. We don't want to be engaging in ageism, but it seems to me as though there's a balance that we've got to figure out somewhere here. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think part of the problem is that, and it's too late to do anything about that this time, but you've got to find a way to get more younger people into national politics, it seems to me, to encourage them, to give them opportunities. Biden used the word elites. Well, that was kind of snotty, and I think he had Mark Warner in mind, and Nadler in Brooklyn in mind as the elites who were making the determinations.
Trying to push him out.
Yeah. And so those are both old men. Look what they have to go through. I ran for office once for a school board in New Jersey, and I won by a single vote. Mine. They called me at midnight and said, "You won by one vote. Must have been yours." I said, "Okay, I'm on a school board. This is a wonderful opportunity to participate in democracy." Yeah? No, it wasn't. If you differed with the chair of the school board, they just pulled the rug out from under you. I got going to protect young teachers seeking tenure. I had 5 wonderful candidates for tenure. And I gave a speech to a room full of people. And I looked at the clock. It was 9 o'clock at night. I thought it was getting pretty late. I should shut this down. it was 9 o'clock at night, and they were all ticked off at me because I was keeping them from watching Monday Night Football. And being on the school board there was not glorious, but everybody there got a contract for something. The chairman of the board drove around in his Chrysler Imperial milking the parking meters, literally a bag man. Now, I was young, I was eager, I was willing to serve, but I saw what the obstacles. And even though the legal women voters had asked me to run, there was no way to get ahead. And that's just my own little experience. But it's a real slog to get ahead because it's become, in a way, a I don't know how to put this, but a seniority within parties, no matter what the office is.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get somebody bright with new ideas?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good luck.
Yeah, and it's a meat grinder of a process too.
Yes.
I think that might be, and there's a lot of cynicism out there about politics. There's a lot of money in politics. It's been interesting to watch this discussion about Biden, that a lot of the people driving the discussion are what are called major party donors. And there just seems something odd about that it's really the money people that are driving the discussion. It's not, I remember when Nixon, I remember prominent senators who went over to the White House and said, it's time for you to resign. Somehow there's something better, cleaner about that than having, people that have made a ton of money in their lives making this call and making this decision. But money is what really makes politics run these days. It probably always has, but it seems much more so today than ever.
Yeah, and it was a Supreme Court decision that allowed all sorts of money in without any accounting for it.
Yeah, Citizens United.
Yeah. We need a hard look at the Supreme Court and at Congress that is willing to take a hard look at the Supreme Court. I don't know if you need a constitutional convention to do these things, but there are enough red flags. We have to re-examine some of these things.
Let's talk, I guess, maybe reality here. Here we are in 2024. It isn't back in the 1920s or 30s where you can keep things private. There's social media, there's a lot of newspapers out there. It just seems today, as we sit here pretty soon after the 4th of July, that the drip, 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 this story's not going to go away. Let's talk about some different scenarios here. I mean, I guess for one, do you think Biden can hang on?
I think it'd be easy to underestimate that man, even if it were not in his best interest or his health. He's always been underestimated. He's taken a lot of knocks. I was with Time magazine as a stringer when he won and became the youngest senator. And I was on the story when his wife and baby were killed. The man, he came back from that, and he went home every night from Washington. He ignored the glitter and to take care of his kids. I mean,
on the train.
Yeah. He has a lot of, maybe you could call them homely qualities, and a lot of touchstones with a whole lot of people who've done a lot of suffering. Can he hang on? I think he wants to hang on. We'll see. It's the irony that the NATO summit is taking place in Washington right now, that the United States is in, let alone can host at the moment. There's a question about the man who's kept us in there and done a lot to keep it together is in peril politically.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, people can be surprised. France just had a huge surprise when an enormous outpouring from the electorate came,
Yeah.
and put Macron, kept him in and kept the extremist out. So I don't know what you make of all of this, but I think a lot's going to depend on what Biden decides to do. And I think he listens just the way Roosevelt did and Woodrow Wilson did. He listens to his family.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And his family certainly his wife seems to be very dead set on him continuing to run. Let's talk about this scenario. Let's say hypothetically that he decides not to run. We're in a different political process where we're not that far away from the election. People are talking about what would happen if there were an open seat, and that certainly has happened in history before too. President Johnson decided not to run for re-election in '68, and the convention in Chicago
exactly.
was kind of a free-for-all, and a lot of people say that's why the Democrats lost. So let's talk a little bit about that. Is there enough time for the Democratic Party, if Biden doesn't run, to be successful in November, based on what we know about history?
Based on what we know about history, history has changed very rapidly because of technology and because of money. It's still possible that another candidate could surface and run. Is it likely? I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller, but Jimmy Carter came from nowhere in a hurry, for example. What about LBJ? That was after the first primaries that he decided, when Bobby Kennedy jumped in, that he could not win. He did not want to split the party.
Mm-hmm.
In LBJ's case, you got Hubert Humphrey.
Right.
Hubert, who was very likable, I think he said the wisest thing I've ever heard about the Senate. He said the Senate washroom was the only place that his colleagues knew what they were doing. But that kind of Cracker Barrel kept him late on every speaking engagement by an hour, and journalists gave up on him. So it has to be somebody who's savvy and experienced and respected.
And that bench seems to be a little thin these days, and maybe that's the fault of the Democratic Party. I mean, I've been reading these stories, and obviously people are talking about Vice President Kamala Harris. There's a few other governors people are mentioning, but the bench doesn't seem to be a plethora of people out there that could easily step in.
I have to agree. And that's part of Joe Biden's dilemma. I'm sure he remembers 1968. He was just breaking into politics himself, and who was alive then that didn't know what happened in Lincoln Park? And it's a terrific responsibility that he's taking on either way. And if it goes south, if it sours, he'll be blamed.
Right.
And he has a sense of history. He has accomplished a great deal. He likes to be referred to as another FDR. But if that's the case, he has to think about FDR and what the consequences of that were.
You talked earlier about this idea of how the American public changing the channel. I mean, we do seem to be an impatient society, and we're constantly looking for the newest, brightest, shiniest new nickel. And I wonder whether or not, we talk about Woodrow Wilson. If Woodrow Wilson could have survived in 2024, if FDR could have withstood the pressure in 2024. And I just wonder if we're at a different time now, and the rules of engagement, the rules have changed.
They are changing. I think they are. But are we ready for the change? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think either party is going to come out of this unscathed. If there is still a Republican Party and not a cult, and if the Democrats can get over some very, very deep divisions, one of which is still amazingly race and the old bugbear of immigration. People have been trying to keep people out of this country since 1798.
Yep.
When John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Act to keep out the French. It's whoever is on the ladder seems to want to stomp on the hands of the next one trying to get onto it and not share any benefits. So I think money has become too much of the equation. But what do you do? How do you police that?
You know, we were talking earlier about medical records, and you mentioned HIPAA, the Privacy Act, and I can't help but think about somebody like Abraham Lincoln, you know, who suffered what they called back in the day melancholy. Today we would call it, he had severe depression. And yet he's, I think, probably considered by many, including historians like you, as being one of the greatest presidents we've had. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a myth.
He's always either number one or number two in the rankings of presidents. And some people don't really know what his medical history was. Some people say, look at his face. His last photographs, he had Bright syndrome. Well, what's Bright syndrome? What he had was melancholy. He'd lost his son. And we've seen that again. Silent Cal Coolidge was not silent until his son died. The personal toll on presidents has to translate into a physical toll as well. You not only have all the strains of the office, but you somehow have to endure all sorts of unforeseen calamities.
You know, given what you said early on about Ben Franklin, the Churchill, some of the other people that were certainly what we would even today consider elderly, I take it that you would not think that the idea of having a hard and fast age limit would make any sense.
No, I don't think it would. If you don't have anybody qualified for the job, you're just going to pick them because they're just under the wire for too old. I don't think that was the intent of the Founding Fathers, that's for sure. It's a long, hard slog to even get to the point of being considered a candidate. Do you just throw that out because of a clock or a calendar? Or do you pick the people who have the best experience, the best record to do the job? I think that's part of the question with Joe Biden.
You say that ultimately this is his decision and his family's decision, but there seem to be other outside forces here that are also quite powerful and prominent too. So how's that going to balance out?
Well, control of the House is a very big one. What so many members of Congress are worried about is their own district. Can they win their own district? They depend on the president to reinforce their candidacy, not have any handicap because of the president. And we've seen what's happened in the last few years with this not even razor thick margin between the two parties. That is what that has meant is Congress has been unable to govern. And the president, if he has an agenda, he can't get it through. So this is a very big crisis. And God bless Joe Biden for having to make this ultimate decision. I don't think we have many people in political life who could.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Cafe and Bakery in Middlesex. Thanks for listening.